Hey guys, tonight we are floating on a warm Hawaiian breeze. You're standing at the edge of Honolulu's shore, listening to the quiet hiss of waves curling over sand. And for just a moment you can almost smell the sweet, heady plumeria drifting through the night air. The stars seem close enough to tap with your finger, and you're about to slip into a story so long and winding that you probably won't survive this without dozing off halfway through. And honestly, that's kind of the point, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, post your location and the time of day in the comments. I want to see where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The scene around you is mid-19th century Hawaii, though of course the name Hawaii is both ancient and new. At this moment, it is still a sovereign kingdom, still holding to its monarchy, still clinging to layers of tradition, even as the tides of foreign trade lap against every shoreline. You tread slowly through the dusty paths of a village, hearing roosters crow, smelling earth baked in sun. Around you, thatched hail, small houses of grass, dot the edges of taro patches. Children run barefoot, shrieking with laughter, while elders sit cross-legged, their voices low and steady as they recall genealogies that stretch back to the gods. In this world, Queen Liliʻuokalani does not yet exist, though the family that will raise her is already carefully watching the skies, noting omens, murmuring about destiny. You hover close, drifting as if you're a spirit at the edge of time. You don't have to worry about being seen. You're just here to listen. The Hawaiian kingdom is only a few decades old in its European-recognized form. King Kamehameha. I had unified the islands not so long before, a feat achieved with diplomacy, warfare, and the steady acquisition of Western ships and firearms. Now by the 1830s, the islands hum with contradictions. Ali'i chiefs still wear feather capes that shimmer in the sun, but Boston missionaries' children already run schools. Canoes slice through the waves, but so do whaling ships dropping anchor by the dozen. Imagine the clash of chants in Hawaiian and sermons in English, the fragrance of roasting pig blending with the sharp sting of imported gin. It's worth pausing here to feel the dissonance. You, stepping down a coral path, can hear a hula drum on one side of the valley and a church bell on the other. This was Hawaii before Liliʻuokalani drew her first breath, an in-between place, caught between tradition and the steady encroachment of global capitalism. Historians still argue whether this exact balance could ever have held, or if collapse was inevitable the moment the first sails appeared on the horizon. It's a debate that keeps graduate students caffeinated well into the night, though you mercifully will probably be snoring before we get too deep into it. Still, one fact remains plain. Hawaii was not some isolated paradise plucked from obscurity by benevolent visitors. It was a sophisticated kingdom, already wrestling with political reforms, already negotiating treaties, already running royal schools. And into this whirling mix of cultural upheaval and fragile sovereignty, a girl would soon be born, one whose songs would outlast her throne. For now, though you're just lingering in the night air, toes brushing sand, staring toward the glow of Honolulu's lamps, you might catch a whiff of candle smoke drifting from the governor's house or the slightly less appealing odor of horse stables. History is never as glamorous as the postcards. And if you listen carefully, you can hear a mother somewhere inside a hail softly humming a lullaby. You don't know it yet, but she is humming into a future where lullabies will become instruments of political resistance, where music will be a queen's final weapon, the quirky tidbit, if you want one to tuck under your pillow. Some visitors in these decades swore that Hawaiians used ground coral powder mixed with oil as a kind of sunscreen, which sounds oddly like the first artisanal spa product. Whether it worked or not is up for debate, but imagine the shimmer of it on brown skin under the pitiless sun. As the scene drifts, you catch yourself yawning. That's fine. This is the first lull, the long inhale before a story begins. In 1838, the woman we will follow was born, though right now the night is still. She is only a possibility, curled quietly in her mother's womb, while the kingdom balances on a knife's edge. The trade winds sigh, pulling the ocean against the reef, and you stand there, sleepy but curious, as if waiting with the island itself. You drift forward in time, and the night of Honolulu's shore begins to brighten with the pale light of dawn. The year is 1838, and the Hawaiian kingdom waits for the arrival of another child into its tangled royal line. You lean against the salt-stained wall of a small house, where the cries of birth echo, muffled but insistent, a sound that has been repeated across centuries, yet still feels like a thunderclap of destiny. Lydia Liliʻuokalani Wewehi Kamakaʻeha was born on September 2nd, 1838, into the family of a high-ranking ali'i. That's her full birth name, a mouthful even if you're fully awake, and you might already feel your eyelids getting heavy from its rolling syllables. She was the daughter of Caesar Kapa'akea and Analea Keohokalole, both descended from distinguished chiefly lines. In Hawaiian society, genealogy wasn't just trivia, it was political power. Imagine every dinner conversation casually, dropping your ancestors back to demigods and deities. Suddenly, your family tree on Ancestry.com feels like a stick figure doodle. Her birth itself was less dramatic than the legends that would later swirl around her life, but you can picture it anyway. The humid room, the flicker of lamplight, attendants whispering chants to safeguard the newborn spirit. Outside, the city of Honolulu stirred awake, sailors stumbling from grog shops, missionaries straightening their stiff collars, while somewhere on the hills, a conch shell sounded to mark the rising sun. The kingdom breathed her first breath with her. Quirky detail time. Hawaiian noble children were sometimes wrapped in kapa cloth printed with geometric patterns thought to strengthen their spiritual energy. It's like the original designer swaddling blanket, centuries before trendy Instagram parents claimed they invented the idea. You imagine her tucked in such cloth, skin gleaming with coconut oil, eyes already alert to the strange, shifting world. From the start, Lydia was placed not only in the arms of her mother, but in the embrace of an entire system of hānai, adoptive kinship. In Hawaii, children were often given to relatives to raise, not as abandonment, but as an expansion of family bonds. This meant Lydia would never truly belong only to her parents. She would be raised with the understanding that she was a child of the broader chiefly class, groomed for roles none of her playmates could imagine. Historians still argue whether this practice was mainly about politics or love, but either way, it gave her a network of parental figures, teachers, and mentors. Step outside the birthing house and walk with me. The Honolulu of her infancy was a mix of dust and progress. Unpaved streets sprawled past trading houses, their shelves crammed with imported fabrics, tools, and whiskey bottles. Canoes carried fish from the reefs, while at the harbor, whaling ships towered with their masts like forests of wood and rope. Lydia grew up at this crossroad of kingdoms, where Hawaiian chants blended with Yankee hymns. If you close your eyes, you can imagine being her small self, crawling on mats while attendants murmur stories of Pele, the volcano goddess, then later being rocked to the sound of a hymn imported from Boston. Two rhythms, two worlds. Both would shape her heart. One mainstream fact to ground you: she was baptized into Christianity at birth, part of the widespread influence of missionaries who had already converted most of the royal family. That means even before she could speak, She had been symbolically claimed by the cross as well as the kapu traditions of her ancestors. Dual identity was baked into her life before she could walk. Picture her toddling in the palace grounds, though palace in this era might look humbler than you expect. It wasn't yet the grand Iolani Palace of later years, but simpler royal dwellings, wood, coral rock, and imported furniture. She would have seen Ali in both feather capes and western coats, their wardrobes split personalities, reflecting the islands themselves. And you're walking softly behind, like a sleepy tour guide who's lost the map but pretends otherwise. Every so often a rooster crows too loud and you flinch, annoyed. Don't worry. Soon it will fade into the steady lull of her life unfolding. The quirky tidbit continues. Some foreigners in these years complained that Hawaiian royals threw such elaborate luau's for births and milestones that they practically bankrupted themselves. Imagine Lydia's family, celebrating with roasted pig, poi, and endless music, while some missionary neighbor shook his head and wrote angry diary entries about excess. Well, excess is relative, especially when you're 3 cups of awa deep and drifting toward a nap. Already, whispers circulated about her destiny. In Hawaii, children of noble bloodlines were watched with sharp eyes. Who might become regent, who might inherit titles, who might marry whom. Even as an infant, Lydia was part of these calculations. You can almost hear old chiefs murmuring as they rock in the shade. This girl, she may have a role one day. So here she lies, a newborn in 1838 Honolulu, unaware of the tides that will drag her from lullabies to legal battles, from music to monarchy. You, however, hover over her cradle, heavy-lidded, watching her tiny fingers curl and uncurl. A kingdom holds its breath and you hold yours, until the rhythm of waves outside lulls you back into the slow drift of history. You step a little further into Lydia's early years, where the routines of a Hawaiian noble child unfold like a rhythm of drums and chants. The world around her is equal parts ordinary and otherworldly, and you feel like a ghost at the edge of her playground. You can almost hear the scuff of her bare feet over packed dirt, smell the faint smoke of a cooking fire, and catch the murmur of elders watching over her. Hawaiian childhood in the 1840s was wrapped in traditions you might call rituals, though to the families practicing them, they were simply life. Lydia's mornings might begin with prayers in Hawaiian, asking for guidance from both Christian God and ancestral spirits, because balance was the art everyone walked. Soon after, lessons in kapu, the ancient system of rules that governed everything from eating to speech, were whispered to her. You, half dreaming, might think of kapu as a cosmic rulebook, written in ink you can't quite read. Break it, and spiritual or social disaster followed. Even children were expected to know where the invisible lines were drawn. One mainstream fact worth holding: the kapu system officially ended in 1819, years before Lydia was born, when King Kamehameha II and Queen Kahumanu broke it by publicly eating with women. But the echoes of kapu still lingered in customs and in whispers. You can picture Lydia tugging at her mother's skirt, asking if she can sit where she pleases or eat when she likes, while older relatives caution her with stories of how things once were. The shadow of kapu remained in her childhood, like a rule you half remember from a game but still feel nervous about breaking. Imagine her at play. Children of her rank were trained not just in games for fun, but in chants, dances, and even mock battles. She might have raced with friends in the grass, but at the same time she learned mele, the complex poetic chants that preserve genealogies. So while you were probably singing Itsy Bitsy Spider at that age, she was memorizing lineages that reached back to gods. Sleepy yet? You should be. A quirky tidbit for your pillow. One children's game called konane was basically Hawaiian checkers, played with black and white pebbles on a stone board. Lydia might have hunched over a board, hair falling into her eyes, while a cousin or hānai sibling made their next move. Missionary guests sometimes assumed it was gambling, because of course they did. But for Hawaiian kids, it was just the same boredom killer as candy. Land historians still argue whether the Hawaiian childhood of Lydia's era was gentler or stricter than the missionary-style upbringing. That was arriving at the same time. Some say Hawaiian ali'i children were indulged with affection. Others claim they were tightly disciplined for leadership. You can imagine both being true, depending on which elder happened to be in charge that day. As Lydia grew, chants and rituals filled her memory. She would have heard hula drums pounding in her ears, smelled leis woven of fresh ginger and ilima, and carried the weight of expectation even as a little girl. You hover nearby, trying to keep your eyes open while she twirls in early hula practice, arms swaying in a rhythm taught by an auntie. The movements weren't just dancing, they were storytelling, the kind that carved itself into memory and into identity. The blending of Christian lessons and Hawaiian practices sometimes left her childhood a patchwork quilt. Picture one day. She sits in a corner of a church school struggling to trace English letters with a piece of chalk. The next day she kneels before an elder who teaches her an ollie, a chant so ancient that even her teacher admits its origins are lost. Both worlds were hers, and both worlds demanded loyalty. Evenings would bring gatherings where chiefs and their families feasted, sang, and listened to orators. Lydia, as a child, must have absorbed the rhythm of speeches that were half entertainment, half political maneuver. Can you hear the lilt of a storyteller's voice, rolling on and on as oil lamps flicker, and children fight to stay awake? You're in the same position right now, fighting a soft tide of drowsiness, lulled by history's cadence. One more odd little detail to tuck under your blanket. Some ali'i children were bathed not in plain water, but in special herbal infusions, thought to give strength and spiritual purity. So imagine baby Lydia splashing in fragrant water steeped with leaves, smelling faintly like a natural tea bag. It sounds like a wellness spa treatment you'd pay too much for now. But back then it was simply part of growing up noble. She didn't yet know it, but this blend of tradition and adaptation would define her life. She would always be balancing between chants and hymns, kapu shadows and missionary rules, ali indulgence and stern Christian discipline. And you, walking behind her in your imagination, feel the same push and pull, your mind caught between curiosity and sleep, between the urge to stay alert and the warmth of drifting off. So the little girl runs on, chasing other noble children under a hot sun, her laughter carrying across fields, while behind her the surf keeps pounding its eternal drum. You let that rhythm steady your own breath in and out, matching the ocean. Childhood is fleeting. History is slow, and you are floating somewhere between the two, eyelids heavy, listening as Lydia's world takes shape. You wander further into Lydia's youth, the days when she was sent into classrooms shaped by the foreign missionaries who had already planted their roots in the Hawaiian Islands. The year is edging into the 1840s and 1850s, and suddenly the soft chants of childhood are replaced by the scratch of chalk on slate boards, the shuffle of desks, and the stern gaze of teachers in stiff collars. You step inside one of those early schools, the air stuffy with heat, the sound of waves faint through the windows, and you realize this is where Lydia begins to straddle two worlds more fully than ever. Her parents, knowing her chiefly rank, enrolled her in the chief's children's school, later called the Royal School, founded by American missionaries Amos and Juliet Cook. Here, Lydia and her siblings, along with other high-ranking ali'i children, were trained with a very specific goal: to become the next generation of rulers in a kingdom already buffeted by international pressure. It was less a normal childhood education and more a grooming program wrapped in Bible verses. a mainstream fact to hold on to. Every monarch of Hawaii after Kamehameha III came through that school. Imagine that. One small building, its wooden floors creaking, held within it nearly every future head of state the islands would ever know. You can almost picture the ghostly weight of destiny pressing into the very floorboards. You sit beside Lydia in a stiff wooden chair. Her small hands clutch a slate, chalk squeaking as she copies out English words she barely understands. Around her, the voices of other royal children rise and fall, future kings and queens muttering their way through arithmetic tables. A teacher's voice drones on about morality, about the sins of idleness, while Lydia sneaks a glance at the open window, where she can glimpse the freedom of palm trees swaying. You feel that pull too, the urge to escape, but you're stuck here with her, listening, because this school is shaping her into someone who will fight for a throne decades later. Quirky tidbit. Juliet Cook, the headmistress, insisted that the Alii children eat with knives and forks, dress in heavy wool garments and sit through long, formal meals where elbows on the table were practically a crime. Imagine Hawaiian kids, used to eating poi with their fingers, staring at a boiled potato and wondering how to politely stab it. Lydia probably learned to master these stiff manners, but you can bet she rolled her eyes when no one was looking. Historians still argue whether this westernized education strengthened the Hawaiian monarchy by preparing its leaders to deal with foreign powers, or whether it alienated them from their people by severing too many cultural roots. Lydia, for her part, absorbed both: the strict morality of her missionary teachers and the deep traditions her family whispered to her after school. You trail her through those long days. Mornings began with hymns, voices raised in English, though Lydia's tongue still wrapped itself around Hawaiian words when she whispered to her classmates. Lessons followed: geography, arithmetic, scripture memorization. The Cooks, believing they were building Christian monarchs, enforced discipline that must have felt endless to children born into palaces and luau's. But Lydia was clever. She excelled in music, in literature, in languages. Her mind was restless, always hungry. She began writing small compositions even as a child, jotting down melodies, sometimes humming them under her breath during lectures. You can lean closer now, hear her tapping her chalk rhythmically on the desk, turning boredom into the skeleton of a song. Evenings back at home were gentler. You can follow her as she leaves the school, stepping back into a Hawaiian household where chants still lingered in the twilight. Her parents or guardians would remind her of her ancestry, of the genealogies that missionaries couldn't erase, so she grew up double-voiced, singing hymns by day, hearing mele by night, and yes, if you're waiting for your quirky spa moment, the school was rumored to have been so strict about hygiene that children were sometimes doused with soap and cold water until they nearly shivered blue, a missionary's idea of discipline and health. Lydia must have hated it, her skin prickling, her heart longing for the warmth of her family's hail, where bathing was tied to ritual, not punishment. You shuffle along behind her into adolescence, seeing her begin to rise in confidence. She became fluent in English, skilled in piano, and conversant in politics through osmosis. The classroom had been a cage, but it was also a forge. By her teenage years, Lydia had both the grace of a Hawaiian princess and the polish of a Western-educated debutante. Sit with her one last time in that classroom. The windows are open, the air heavy with the smell of chalk and ink. A teacher is lecturing about the parables of Christ, and Lydia is nodding politely, though in her head she's probably setting the words to music. The other royal children around her, her siblings, her cousins, her future rivals, are fidgeting. And you too are fidgeting, though mostly because your eyelids are sagging. The droning voice of the missionary, the scratch of chalk, the endless hum of rules, It's practically an ASMR session of the 19th century, so you lean back, letting the sound blur into white noise. Lydia sits tall, her young face calm, her future still hidden but slowly forming. The chief's children's school keeps drilling, keeps hammering, and she keeps absorbing. Someday she will fight with words and songs rather than weapons, and the roots of that ability are here, in this room where you are trying so hard not to nod off. You shuffle forward with Lydia, who by now is no longer a baby cradled in swaddling cloth, or a student trapped in the chalk-dusted halls of the royal school. She's stepping into a world of complicated family arrangements, the hānai system, Hawaiian adoption, that shaped her life in ways that would seem unusual if you only know adoption in the modern sense. For Hawaiians, hānai was not about secrecy or breaking ties. It was about expanding bonds, redistributing children to strengthen families, and weaving connections as wide as the ocean itself. Lydia, like many noble children, was given into the care of others not long after her birth. She was hānai'd to Abner Paka and Laura Konia, a prominent couple in the Ali class, who also raised their biological daughter Bernice Pauahi. If that name makes you perk up, good. Pauahi would later inherit vast lands and found the Kamehameha schools, but for now, she was Lydia's foster sister, playmate, and a kind of mirror. The two girls grew up side by side, one day racing across palace grounds barefoot, the next day tiptoeing in stiff gowns at missionary functions. The mainstream fact here, hānai was an established Hawaiian custom practiced across social classes, deeply embedded in culture, and it wasn't considered odd or shameful at all. Instead, it was celebrated. Children were believed to carry spiritual and political gifts that could benefit different families, so sharing them was a way of sharing power. Imagine if your aunt just casually asked to raise your newborn because she thought it would balance the family tree better, and everyone agreed this was wise. That was Lydia's reality. Now picture the young girl's life in Paka and Konia's household. It was a blend of Hawaiian warmth and missionary influence. The hānai parents were strict, determined to shape Lydia with a sense of discipline, but they also gave her access to education and refinement. At night, she might fall asleep on mats beside Pauahi, listening to the older generation chant genealogies. By day, she'd sit at the piano, striking chords under Konia's watchful ear. You're there in the corner, eyelids half shut, listening to the mixture of laughter and music. Here's your quirky tidbit. One early visitor described how Hawaiian noble households sometimes held pet pigs indoors, letting them wander in and out as casually as cats. Imagine Lydia trying to do her lessons, while a squealing piglet waddled through the room demanding scraps. Forget golden retrievers. This was the true ali'i childhood companion. Historians still argue whether Lydia's hānai upbringing distanced her from her biological siblings or simply gave her more networks of loyalty. She remained close with her birth family all her life, but her deepest bonds often lay with her hānai relatives, especially Pauahi. That closeness would echo decades later, when Lydia supported Pauahi's decision to bequeath her lands to education instead of to the monarchy. You trail Lydia through moments that reveal both tenderness and friction. The Paka household expected Lydia to follow rules strictly. Imagine her sitting straight-backed at meals, knife and fork in hand, silently rehearsing etiquette while her thoughts wandered to melodies she wanted to compose. She wasn't naturally rebellious, but she had a streak of quiet independence, and even as a girl she showed a resolve that must have exasperated her guardians at times. Even her name shifted with context. Though born Lydia, she was often called by her Hawaiian names in family circles, each name carrying a meaning tied to lineage and prophecy. You can almost hear her guardians reminding her of the weight behind those syllables, It wasn't just a name, it was a story, a claim to heritage, and perhaps a hint at her eventual destiny. The household was also one of contrast. On one hand, Pauahi was groomed with the finest Western-style education, even traveling abroad. On the other, the two girls were still surrounded by Hawaiian customs. The smell of poi being pounded, the sound of mele echoing in courtyards, the occasional scolding in Hawaiian when chores were neglected. Lydia absorbed it all, storing away melodies, phrases, and impressions that would later spill out in her writing. And here's where your eyelids might grow heavy again. Imagine a long Hawaiian evening in that household. Oil lamps flicker. The older generation sings softly, their voices low and steady. Lydia and Pauahi sit cross-legged, trying to match the rhythm. A piglet squeals once, then settles. The air smells of roasted sweet potato, of damp earth after a sudden rain shower. You let yourself sink into the scene, half dreaming, the details swirling until they blur into the haze of sleep. Through hānai, Lydia learned a valuable lesson early on. Family wasn't rigid, it was expansive. Bonds were made as much as they were inherited. That lesson would stay with her, especially when later in life she was cut off, overthrown, and imprisoned. She would always find family, even in the smallest gestures of loyalty. So she grows up in the Paka household, sometimes chafing under strict rules, sometimes laughing with her foster sister, always balancing between tradition and adaptation. And you, walking invisibly in her shadow, begin to understand how this web of adoption, discipline, and affection laid the groundwork for the queen she would one day become. You follow Lydia into the years when she begins to emerge from girlhood into the polished but complicated life of a young, noble woman. The days of piglets wandering through her hānai household are fading, and in their place come court appearances, formal dinners, and luau's that last deep into the night. You're walking beside her now as she learns how to carry herself not just as someone's daughter or ward, but as a presence. At the royal court, the court of the Hawaiian kingdom in the mid-19th century, was a spectacle of blending. Imagine candle-lit luaus that stretched on for hours, where roasted pigs smoked alongside imported French wines. Chiefs in feather capes stood beside politicians in starched black coats. Lydia, just a young woman, trailed behind her elders at first, her hands nervously adjusting stiff gowns brought in from abroad. The fabric scratched, the corsets pinched, and you can bet she longed for the freedom of kapa cloth. Still, she learned to walk gracefully in these heavy Western dresses, the flicker of candlelight catching her eyes. A mainstream fact to keep in mind: Lydia's brother, David Kalakaua, and other siblings were also prominent in court life. They represented the younger generation of Ali who would inherit the monarchy. The court became not only a place of entertainment, but a political stage where alliances were tested and futures quietly negotiated. You lingered near the music because music was always Lydia's comfort. Even in the middle of elaborate dinners, when foreign dignitaries droned on about treaties, she found herself drawn to the piano in the corner, her fingers itching to play. Sometimes she did, filling the air with melodies that hushed the room. Those songs, half Western in harmony but carrying Hawaiian rhythm, reminded everyone she wasn't just another polished court figure, she was an artist, a composer in the making. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some foreign guests at Hawaiian luau's wrote in their diaries that the alii insisted on serving enormous quantities of jelly. Yes, jelly, as if it were a delicacy equal to roast pig. Lydia must have stared at a wobbling plate of imported gelatin and tried to keep a straight face. Picture her whispering to Pauahi or another cousin, suppressing giggles as some stiff European noble nodded solemnly at dessert. But the court wasn't all feasts and music. it was also expectation. Lydia was watched carefully. Her behavior, her composure, her willingness to embody both Hawaiian dignity and missionary-approved propriety. Every step she took through palace halls was a test. You can almost hear the murmurs. That one, she carries herself with steadiness. And she did. Her quiet strength, even as a young woman, made her a presence people remembered. Historians still argue whether the Hawaiian court of this period was a genuine blend of cultures or a forced performance designed to appease foreign eyes. Some say the luaus and gowns represented Hawaiian adaptability. Others insist they symbolized a kingdom slowly bending under pressure. You drifting through the candle smoke can feel both truths flicker at once. Step into one evening. Lydia stands at a grand luau under the stars, the tables groaning with food. Musicians strum guitars, blending Spanish influence into Hawaiian melee. Guests laugh, servants bustle, the sea whispers just beyond the torches. Lydia listens politely to a British visitor drone about shipping lanes, nodding at the right times, while secretly her mind drifts to a melody she'll later hum to herself. You hover close, fighting your own drowsiness as the night stretches long. At quieter moments, she retreats to her writing. Lydia kept journals and letters, practicing her English prose. You can see her hunched over paper, candle burning low, the scratch of pen matching the scratch of your own tired thoughts. These private moments were her escape from the suffocating expectations of court. Another small detail, one of her favorite things, even as a noblewoman, was simply walking in gardens, weaving leis from fresh flowers. Imagine her sitting cross-legged in a gown too expensive for grass stains, her lap full of blossoms, threading them one by one. It's both dignified and childlike, a reminder that she carried joy into spaces where she was expected to be nothing but serious. The court life shaped her, but it didn't change her essence. Beneath the corsets and candlelight, Lydia remained thoughtful, musical, sometimes quietly stubborn. She learned the rituals of diplomacy, how to keep her face calm when politics swirled, but she never lost the Hawaiian heartbeat that pulsed through her melodies. And you, trailing her through the palace corridors, feel that heartbeat in your own chest. The air is heavy with candle smoke. The sound of distant surf murmurs through the night, and you're so drowsy that the flicker of torches begins to blur. Court life was glamorous and suffocating all at once, and Lydia, steady as ever, walked its line with quiet grace. You move with Lydia now into a chapter of her life that is more personal and far less comfortable than luau's under torchlight. Her marriage to John Owen Dominis. You can almost feel the shift in the air. Gone are the cheerful notes of court music, replaced by the quieter clink of silverware in an awkward household where affection is never quite settled. Lydia married John in 1862. He was the son of an American sea captain, John Dominis Sr., and Mary Dominis, who had settled in Hawaii decades earlier. Their family home, Washington Place, was a fine white-pillared mansion in Honolulu, named in honor of George Washington. It would later become the official residence of Hawaii's governors, but in Lydia's time, it was simply her marital home. You step through its halls with her now, admiring the imported furniture, the polished floors, and yet feeling the chill that seems to linger despite the Hawaiian sun. The mainstream fact here, this was not a love story. Accounts agree that Lydia's marriage to John was at best complicated, and at worst deeply unhappy. He was often distant, sometimes indifferent, and he never gave her the kind of devotion she longed for. He remained more attached to his mother, Mary, who lived with them and made the household a constant battlefield of subtle control. Imagine Lydia, graceful and intelligent, moving through Washington Place with dignity, while her husband drifted off to his own interests. You sit at their dinner table where conversation feels stilted, forks scrape plates too loudly, and Mary Dominis casts sharp looks across the table. Lydia responds with calm politeness, but you sense the tension. You may even want to excuse yourself from this dinner, but unfortunately you're stuck here with her, enduring the silence, a quirky tidbit to lighten the gloom. John Dominis was said to be an avid hunter of birds, a hobby that must have seemed odd to his musically gifted wife, who adored the songs of living creatures. Imagine him tromping through fields with a rifle, while Lydia stayed indoors composing delicate piano melodies. It's a domestic mismatch straight out of a sitcom, except this one never resolved in 30 minutes. Historians still argue whether Lydia's marriage was politically advantageous or simply an unfortunate personal tie. Some say it gave her valuable connections to American families. Others insist it burdened her with isolation and disappointment. You, watching from the corner of their parlor, can see why the debate continues. She had status, yes, but she lacked warmth. Yet Lydia was no passive sufferer. She poured her frustrations into her art. In those years, she composed some of her most enduring songs, music that blended Hawaiian spirit with Western harmonies. You can imagine her sitting at the piano in Washington Place, fingers moving across ivory keys, while John and his mother drifted in other rooms, barely noticing. Her compositions became her confidants, melodies carrying emotions she could not voice aloud. The marriage also tested her patience and resolve. Lydia wanted children desperately, but she and John never had any of their own. Instead, she lavished maternal affection on her hānai nieces and nephews, knitting that wider Hawaiian custom into her own longing. You might picture her guiding small hands over piano keys, or braiding flowers into a lei for a child's head, moments of tenderness that filled the emptiness of her household. Even Washington Place itself became part of the tension. Though stately, the mansion felt like it belonged more to Mary Dominis than to Lydia. Walk its corridors with her. Portraits of foreign figures hang on the walls. The smell of imported furniture polish lingers, and whispers of disapproval seem to echo in each room. Lydia, who carried the weight of Hawaiian tradition, must have felt like a guest in her own home. Another curious little note: guests often commented that Mary Dominis insisted on overly formal European dining habits, with multiple courses and fussy etiquette. Lydia, already trained at the Royal School to handle forks and knives, likely complied with ease, but you can almost hear her internal sigh. Imagine craving poi and laulau while being forced to navigate a soup spoon. Despite it all, Lydia remained outwardly composed. She fulfilled her duties as wife, as noblewoman, and as a figure of dignity in Honolulu society. She attended gatherings, supported charitable works, and composed music that became beloved across the islands. To outsiders, she seemed serene. Only in her songs did she reveal the deeper sorrows, so you sit with her in the parlor as twilight falls. The room glows with lamplight. John is absent again, and Mary mutters to herself in another room. Lydia rests her hands on the piano keys, plays a soft tune that trembles like her heart, and then lets the melody fade into silence. You lean back, your eyes heavy, the household's awkwardness settling around you like a thick blanket. It isn't romantic, it isn't fair, but it is shaping her, tempering her patience, deepening her resilience, and giving her songs that will outlast the marriage itself. You slip into the next stretch of Lydia's life, where her identity as a musician and composer becomes more than a pastime. It becomes a defining part of her presence in the kingdom. You leave the tense dining room of Washington Place behind and drift instead toward the faint sound of piano keys being tested, one by one, until a melody unfurls that feels equal parts prayer and protest. Music had been part of Lydia since childhood, but in her married years, it became both sanctuary and weapon. She wasn't just a casual pianist plinking away at tunes. She was a prolific composer who created hundreds of works, songs, hymns, chants that married Western harmonies with Hawaiian soul. You sit near her piano now, the lamplight flickering against polished wood, her fingers moving gracefully across the keys. The melody is soft at first, then stronger until the entire house hums with it. One mainstream fact here: her most famous composition, Aloha O, would eventually become an anthem of farewell recognized around the world. But long before that piece emerged, Lydia was already well known in Hawaii for her musical talent. She composed hymns that blended English lyrics with Hawaiian rhythm, wrote political songs in code, and created lullabies that carried her private heartache. A quirky tidbit: it's said that Lydia sometimes composed songs in the middle of the night, humming them softly so as not to disturb anyone. You can picture her sitting in her nightgown, candle guttering low, jotting down notes while Honolulu slept. Her neighbors might have thought the house was quiet, but inside, she was scribbling the foundations of melodies that people would hum for generations. Historians still argue whether Lydia's compositions were primarily personal or political. Was she simply expressing her inner world, or was she consciously shaping music as a cultural weapon against colonial influence? The truth is probably both. Her songs are full of love, sorrow, and longing, but they also preserve the Hawaiian language, encode protest, and assert identity. Follow her into a gathering, a small salon, guests seated with glasses of wine, and Lydia at the piano. She plays a piece that makes the room hush. Her voice rises clear and steady, carrying words in Hawaiian that not all guests understand. You do, though, or at least you feel the undercurrent. It is music as memory, music as resistance. The missionaries may have scolded hula out of schools, but Lydia smuggled rhythm and history back in through melody. Another detail: Lydia collaborated with musicians across Honolulu, sometimes mentoring younger singers, sometimes sharing her works with choirs. She had an ear for harmony and could pick out the voices that would carry her compositions best. Imagine her at rehearsal, clapping her hands to set tempo, smiling gently at mistakes, then guiding the singers back into the right notes. But it wasn't all lofty artistry. Some of her pieces were playful. She wrote love songs, teasing songs, even humorous ditties meant to entertain at luaus. You picture her at one of these gatherings, laughing softly as she plays a jaunty tune while relatives clap along. Someone shouts a joke, and Lydia tosses back a dry comment, her sense of humor slipping into the room through music. Washington Place, with all its tensions, still vibrated with her songs. The piano was her confidant, the manuscript paper her diary. Nights when John was absent or indifferent, she poured herself into music. Days when her role as a noblewoman weighed heavily, she lightened it with melody. Her art wasn't just an escape. It was a declaration that she existed on her own terms. And you, sitting beside her in imagination, feel the lull of the piano seep into your bones. Each note seems to stretch a little longer, as if encouraging your breath to slow. Your eyelids droop with the rhythm. Her music, even across time, still has that effect. It settles you, rocks you into calm. One last quirky image. Some said that when Lydia hosted friends, she'd switch mid-piece from classical European styles to lively Hawaiian rhythms, watching the dignified foreigners fumble to keep up. You can almost hear her chuckle as stiff diplomats tried to clap on the beat. So here she is, queen-to-be, but for now simply Lydia, the songbird of Hawaii. Her fingers move over keys. Her voice carries words that linger in the air long after the sound fades. And you sit nearby, your head nodding gently, lulled by the thought that music can sometimes outlast even thrones, you drift with Lydia into the restless years when music and marriage could no longer distract from the storm clouds gathering over Hawaii's politics. The melodies of her piano echo through Washington Place, but outside its white-pillared walls, whispers of power and profit swirl louder than any song. You step into the streets of Honolulu, dusty with cart tracks crowded with sailors, and buzzing with rumors, because the sugar barons are scheming. By the 1870s, sugar had become Hawaii's golden ticket and its golden trap. Planters, many of them American or European descendants, controlled vast fields, and their wealth gave them more influence than their actual titles suggested. They eyed every law, every treaty, every royal decision with hungry suspicion. Lydia, though not yet queen, lived in a household where she could not avoid hearing these mutterings. Letters carried gossip, visitors brought complaints, and even the most innocent social gathering turned political once the coffee cooled. The mainstream fact: the Reciprocity Treaty of 1875 allowed Hawaiian sugar to enter the United States duty-free. It was a boon for the planters, whose profits skyrocketed, but it tied Hawaii's economy ever more tightly to the US. Lydia may not have negotiated the treaty herself, but she lived in its shadow. With every spoonful of sugar sweetening her tea, she must have felt the irony. That sweetness was dissolving the kingdom's independence grain by grain. Imagine yourself trailing her at a formal dinner. Across the table, a planter leans in, voice low, grumbling that the monarchy must never restrict his profits. Another whispers about closer ties to Washington, D.C. Lydia smiles politely, hands folded, but inside her mind churns. She was not yet queen, but she was always listening, absorbing, remembering. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some sugar barons were known to throw such lavish parties that they imported ice all the way from California to serve chilled drinks in tropical Honolulu. Picture Lydia raising an eyebrow at a sweating glass of iced lemonade, knowing the extravagance masked greed. You can practically hear her thinking, really? Ice cubes as diplomacy? Historians still argue whether the monarchy could have reined in the planters earlier, or whether the economic dependence on sugar made resistance impossible. Some say the royal family should have diversified the economy. Others argue no small kingdom could have avoided the grasp of American markets. Either way, Lydia walked those palace halls while the debate hummed, her own songs competing with the clatter of politics. Her role, even as a princess, was increasingly public. She attended receptions, entertained diplomats, and showed the world that Hawaii had a cultured elite every bit as refined as Europe's. Yet every handshake came with an undercurrent. Which of these men were loyal to the kingdom, and which were merely biding time until annexation? You hover nearby, sensing the tension in every smile. One evening, Lydia returns home after such an event. She sits at her piano, the sound of wagons clattering outside fading as she begins to play. The notes are soft at first, almost mournful, as if she's trying to wash away the memory of political chatter. Then the melody sharpens, urgent, like her own quiet protest. You lean back, drowsy, the rhythm lulling you even as the history gnaws at the edges of her world. Even family gatherings turned political. Her brothers and cousins debated loudly, some advocating for stronger monarchy, others urging compromise. Lydia often found herself the calm in the storm, her voice steady, her manner dignified. She did not shout. She observed. Later, when her turn came, she would act with that same patience, but she was already storing away lessons in these overheated rooms. And sometimes, despite the tension, there was humor. Imagine her attending a gathering where a pompous visitor proclaimed that Hawaii would surely be better off Americanized, only for a Hawaiian courtier to reply slyly, "Then why do you keep eating our poi?" Lydia would have smiled at that, her eyes glinting with amusement the moment breaking the heaviness. The kingdom was changing. Sugar profits swelled, American influence grew, and foreign businessmen tightened their grip on the legislature. Lydia's song still carried through Washington Place, but outside the air buzzed with deals and alliances. You, drifting along behind her, can almost hear the faint scrape of boots on stone, the sound of men already walking toward the overthrow that lay in the future. But not yet. For now, Lydia balances music and politics, art and observation. The sugar barons whisper, the diplomats flatter, the monarchs try to steady their kingdom, and she stands quietly among them, taking it all in. You listen with her, eyelids heavy as another layer of tension settles over Hawaii like the humid night air. You trail Lydia now as she steps away from the parlor rooms of Washington Place and onto the decks of ships bound for faraway lands. Travel becomes part of her education as a noblewoman, and you can almost feel the shift in the air, the salt spray stinging your face, the roll of waves underfoot, the mingling sense of tar, rope, and tropical fruit packed into barrels. In the 1880s, Lydia traveled widely, Boston, Washington, London, absorbing cultures that both impressed and unsettled her. You, half dreaming, shuffle behind her as she descends onto foreign docks, where carriages clatter and voices speak languages she only partly understands. To her, each journey was a lesson in how small kingdoms survived or failed when confronted with great powers. The mainstream fact: Lydia visited the United States and Europe as part of diplomatic and cultural missions, sometimes representing her brother King Kalakaua, sometimes traveling in her own right. In Washington, she met dignitaries. In Boston, she studied Western institutions. In London, she marveled at Queen Victoria's realm. These travels showed her both the grandeur of empires and the vulnerability of nations like her own. Imagine her walking the cobblestone streets of Boston. The air is cold, biting at her cheeks, so different from Honolulu's warmth. She pulls her cloak tighter, steps carefully over icy patches, and listens as her hosts chatter about industry and railroads. You, trudging beside her, slip a little on the ice and grumble because, honestly, tropical sandals aren't designed for New England winters. A quirky tidbit. While in Boston, Lydia developed a taste for oysters, which were served to her frequently at social events. She later joked in letters that she felt she'd eaten enough oysters to supply the whole of Honolulu. Picture her poking at yet another platter, sighing inwardly and whispering to a companion, "I miss poi." Historians still argue whether these trips broadened her vision or deepened her sense of loss. Some claim she admired the efficiency and power of Western nations. Others insist she returned home more determined to protect Hawaiian traditions from being steamrolled. Perhaps both are true. She saw what Hawaii lacked, but she also saw what Hawaii must never surrender. Follow her into London now. The year is 1887, and she attends Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. Imagine the spectacle. Streets thronged with people, horses decked in ribbons, soldiers in gleaming uniforms. Lydia, dressed in elegant attire, watches the grandeur with a mixture of awe and unease. She knew her kingdom could never match this scale, but she also recognized that smallness didn't mean weakness, if only the world would respect sovereignty. You drift into the banquet halls with her. Chandeliers blaze overhead, crystal glasses clink, dignitaries talk in a dozen accents. Lydia listens carefully, filing away impressions. How power speaks, how it entertains, how it cloaks itself in ceremony. You can see her eyes measuring every detail, already thinking of what lessons might help her own kingdom survive. Back on the ship home, she leans against the railing, the Atlantic wind whipping at her hair. She hums softly, maybe a melody half-formed inspired by her journey. You stand near, chilled, grateful, when she finally retreats below deck. The cabin creaks, the lantern sways, and you both drift with the rhythm of waves. Another quirky image. On one voyage, it's said that Lydia passed the time by teaching sailors Hawaiian songs, laughing as rough voices tried to follow her delicate melodies. Imagine a chorus of deep baritones mangling Hawaiian vowels while she clapped along amused. Even far from home, she carried her culture with her. When she returned to Honolulu, she carried more than souvenirs. She brought back the certainty that Hawaii must be both modern and fiercely itself. She had seen the weight of empires, the casual way small nations were overlooked. She had also seen that women could reign with dignity, as Queen Victoria did. Perhaps in quiet moments, she wondered whether she too might one day bear that burden. You, meanwhile, are bearing the weight of drowsiness. The sound of ships creaking, the endless waves, the muffled laughter of sailors, it all folds around you like a blanket. Lydia keeps her eyes on the horizon, already thinking of what is to come while you let your gaze blur into the rocking sea. You return with Lydia to Honolulu, where her brother David Kalakaua has stepped into the center of the stage. The year is 1874, and after a contentious election in the Hawaiian legislature, Kalakaua is crowned king. You drift with Lydia through the crowded streets, where cheering and scowling mingle in equal measure, because not everyone wanted him on the throne. Some had supported Queen Emma, the widow of Kamehameha IV, and bitterness still lingered like smoke after a brush fire. Kalakaua, ever ambitious and flamboyant, embraced pageantry. His coronation was a spectacle of feathers, chants, cannons, and imported European regalia. Lydia watched as her brother leaned into ceremony, convinced that outward grandeur would earn respect for the Hawaiian kingdom abroad. You stand with her under a hot sun, squinting at the gleam of crowns and the shimmer of royal capes. Drums thunder, muskets fire, and the crowd roars, some from loyalty, others because noise is contagious. Here's the mainstream fact. Kalakaua became known as the Merry Monarch for his love of hula, music, and lavish celebrations. Under his reign, Hawaiian cultural traditions, once suppressed by missionaries, were revived with new vigor. Lydia, already a musician herself, delighted in this cultural flourishing. Imagine the two of them at an evening gathering, trading melodies, encouraging dancers, filling the palace with music that blended old chants and new compositions. But alongside the merriment was political unease. Foreign businessmen eyed Kalakaua's spending with suspicion, while some Hawaiians questioned whether his extravagance weakened the kingdom. You can hear the murmurs in the crowd. Too many parties, too many debts. Lydia, dignified as always, stood by her brother, though she must have seen the dangers too. Quirky tidbit: Kalakaua's coronation feast reportedly included an entire roasted ox stuffed with pigs, which in turn were stuffed with ducks, then chickens, then smaller birds. It was the Russian nesting doll of meat courses. Picture Lydia raising her eyebrows politely, while some guest with a too-tight vest tried to carve through layers of animal like opening a very greasy gift box. Historians still argue whether Kalakaua's cultural revival strengthened Hawaiian identity or played into stereotypes that foreigners mocked. Was hula at the palace a statement of pride or an easy caricature for visiting journalists? The debate lingers, though you, standing beside Lydia, feel the importance of reclaiming joy in the face of encroaching control. As the king's sister, Lydia's public role expanded. She was now part of the ruling family's image, expected to attend ceremonies, host dignitaries, and project royal dignity. She learned to smile through endless toasts, to listen patiently to speeches about trade, and to remind guests, through her presence alone, that Hawaii had queens and princesses every bit as poised as Europe. Yet she also glimpsed her brother's vulnerabilities. Kalakaua's love of ceremony sometimes veered into excess. He borrowed heavily, spent lavishly, and entertained continuously. You can almost hear Lydia sigh in private, perhaps urging restraint, though she remained loyal. When critics grew harsh, she defended him. Because family was family, and the monarchy was fragile enough without division. At night, when the palace quieted, Lydia might slip into a side room to play the piano, the echo of her brother's grand parties still ringing in her ears. Her melodies were softer, steadier, like a counterbalance to his extravagance. You sit nearby, grateful for the calm after cannon fire, the notes washing over you like a lullaby. Another odd little note: Kalakaua was fascinated with technology and once had electric lighting installed at Iolani Palace before even the White House had it. Imagine Lydia walking through the halls, blinking at the new electric glow, muttering under her breath about how much she missed the flicker of oil lamps. Change was always dazzling, but it was also unsettling. Still, Kalakaua's reign carried a sense of hope in those early years. Hawaii's monarchy was vibrant, culture was alive, and Lydia's role was secure. The shadows of sugar barons and annexationists were still gathering, but for the moment the kingdom danced. You, swaying tiredly in the background, feel the rhythm of drums fading into the soft pulse of your own heartbeat. The merry monarch is crowned, the feast is finished, and Lydia walks calmly from the blaze of celebration into the steady darkness of another Honolulu night. You drift deeper into palace life with Lydia, now no longer just the king's sister, but his trusted regent. When her brother Kalakaua traveled abroad, especially during his 1881 world tour, she was left in charge of the kingdom. Imagine the sudden weight on her shoulders. One day she is attending luau's and composing songs, and the next she is signing royal documents, listening to ministers argue, and trying to keep foreign diplomats satisfied without giving away the kingdom's sovereignty. The mainstream fact, in 1881, when Kalakaua became the first reigning monarch to circumnavigate the globe, Lydia ruled as regent in his absence. She presided over the government for nearly a year, handling the affairs of state with dignity and competence. It was proof to everyone, including herself, that she could govern. Picture her walking through the corridors of Iolani Palace, papers tucked under her arm, her brow furrowed but calm. Ministers bow, clerks shuffle, couriers rush in with letters sealed in wax. She listens, weighs decisions, and signs her name with a steady hand. You hover nearby, yawning, because honestly, palace paperwork isn't glamorous, but it is steady, rhythmic, like waves lapping against the reef. Quirky tidbit: while acting as regent, Lydia reportedly entertained visitors by performing her own songs, sometimes at the piano in the very palace halls where she was ruling. Imagine a head of state finishing a serious conversation about tariffs, only to be invited to sit and listen to a lullaby composed on the spot. It's multitasking at queenly levels. Statecraft and serenade historians still argue whether her regency showed a natural aptitude for leadership or whether her authority was undermined by the fact that ultimate power still rested with her absent brother. Some accounts describe her as decisive and wise. Others say her decisions were second-guessed by ministers who never stopped comparing her to the king. You can almost hear those mutters in the hallways, sharp whispers that fade when she steps into the room. Her regency coincided with troubling times. Smallpox threatened the islands, leading to quarantines and fear. Lydia had to oversee public health measures, balancing compassion with sternness. Picture her signing orders to limit gatherings, her heart heavy knowing that Hawaiian traditions of communal feasting and dancing had to be restrained. It was a reminder that ruling wasn't only about pageantry, it was about responsibility. And yet she kept her poise. Evening came, and she would step out onto the palace balcony, the city of Honolulu stretching below, lamps glowing faintly in the dusk. She must have felt both the thrill of power and the loneliness of it. You stand beside her now, the trade winds brushing your face, the sound of surf faint in the distance, and you realize this was her first true taste of monarchy. Another quirky image. One anecdote suggests that Lydia, when asked about her brother's travels, sometimes made sly jokes about him collecting more banquets than treaties. You can picture her smiling knowingly, eyes twinkling as if to say, "Yes, my brother loves a party, but I'm the one keeping the kingdom upright." She also showed her deep care for the Hawaiian people. During her regency, she continued to support schools and charitable organizations, visiting them personally. Imagine her walking through a classroom, children rising respectfully, their small voices reciting lessons. She smiles, nods, and perhaps even hums a tune to them before leaving. It's the gentler side of governance, and it mattered just as much as politics. You, meanwhile, are feeling the palace's rhythm settle into your own body. Footsteps on marble floors, papers shuffled on desks, the distant hum of a piano in another room. It all blends into a lull that makes your eyelids heavy. Lydia carries herself with quiet strength, and you, watching invisibly, are lulled by the steadiness. Her time as regent ended when Kalakaua returned, full of stories of his travels and new ideas that would shape and sometimes strain the kingdom. But for Lydia, the regency proved something she could never forget. She was capable of ruling. And someday, when fate thrust the crown upon her, she would remember these nights in the palace when she carried Hawaii's burdens alone. You step into one of the most jarring moments in Hawaii's history, and you can feel the tension thicken in the humid air. The year is 1887, and Lydia's brother Kalakaua, her merry monarch, finds himself cornered by armed men demanding his signature. This document would later be called the Bayonet Constitution, and its shadow falls heavily over Lydia's path toward her own reign. The mainstream fact, the Bayonet Constitution was imposed on King Kalakaua by a group of mostly American and European businessmen and their militia, forcing him at gunpoint to sign away much of the monarchy's authority. It stripped the king of power, gave control of the government to a cabinet approved by the foreign elite, and restricted voting rights to favor wealthy landowners, mostly white sugar planters. Picture the scene with Lydia nearby. The palace is hot, the king pale and trembling as rifles glint outside the windows. She isn't the one holding the pen, but she is close enough to hear the scratching as her brother's signature bleeds across the page. You, standing in the corner, shiver despite the heat. History sometimes moves quietly, but tonight it moves with the sound of gunmetal clicking into place. Quirky tidbit. Some locals whispered that the document earned its nickname because Kalakaua signed it with the points of bayonets literally aimed at him. Whether or not that exact image is true, the name stuck. And you can imagine Lydia's biting sarcasm about it later. Lovely. Nothing like constitutional reform delivered with cold steel. Historians still argue whether Kalakaua had any choice. Could he have resisted, risking bloodshed? Or was surrender the only way to preserve at least a fragment of Hawaiian sovereignty? Some argue his signature was cowardly. Others insist it was pragmatic survival. Lydia must have wrestled with both views, watching her brother's pride buckle under the weight of foreign threats. The aftermath was grim. The monarchy's role shrank. The legislature tilted toward the planters, and Hawaiians who did not meet property qualifications were pushed aside politically in their own homeland. Lydia, dignified as always, continued her public duties, but she must have felt the sting of betrayal, foreigners dictating rules in her ancestral land. Imagine her walking through Honolulu after the Constitution's imposition. She sees Hawaiian workers laboring in sugar fields that enrich others, while the voice of her people is diminished in government. She greets them with gentle words, but behind her eyes lies fury. You trail after her, sensing the dissonance, outward calm, inward fire. Another detail worth lingering on, Lydia later wrote that she believed her brother was pressured into the Constitution by a cabal that sought annexation to the United States. She would carry that memory into her own reign, vowing to undo the damage. Even in quiet evenings when she sat at her piano, her melodies carried an undercurrent of resistance. Yet there was still humor at times, because Hawaiians have always had a way of finding levity amid hardship. Imagine Lydia overhearing common folk calling the new arrangement the foreigner's toy constitution, and raising an eyebrow with dry approval. Sometimes laughter is the sharpest protest. For Lydia personally, the bayonet constitution was a lesson in fragility. She saw that monarchy could be stripped of its essence, not by armies from abroad, but by businessmen at home with enough rifles and ambition. The kingdom still had a crown, but it was hollowed. You stand beside her as she considers this, the weight of what may come pressing down like the sticky island heat. At night, she might have walked alone in palace gardens, torchlight flickering on the leaves, thinking of her brother's weary face bent over that document. You can almost hear her whisper to herself, "When my turn comes, I will not yield so easily." You, meanwhile, are weary just following her. The murmurs of politics, the clatter of rifles, the endless arguments of historians. It's enough to lull even the most caffeinated mind. The bayonet constitution marks the slow unraveling of Hawaiian sovereignty, and Lydia knows it. You know it, but tonight, under the dim glow of lamps, you let the weight of history press you into drowsiness. You walk with Lydia into 1891, the year the crown finally rests on her head. Her brother Kalakaua, worn down by years of tension and illness, has died in San Francisco while seeking medical treatment. The news drifts back across the Pacific, and Honolulu holds its breath. Lydia, still princess, becomes Liliʻuokalani, Queen of Hawaii. The mainstream fact: Liliʻuokalani was proclaimed queen on January 29, 1891. She was the first and only woman ever to rule Hawaii as monarch in her own right. The transition was ceremonial, but also heavy with unease. The monarchy was already weakened by the bayonet constitution, and foreign powers circled like sharks. Picture the moment of her proclamation. Drums thunder, conch shells blow, and crowds gather in front of Iolani Palace. Some weep openly, mourning Kalakaua. Others cheer, voices rising in hope that his sister will carry forward his legacy. You stand in the thick of the crowd, the sun beating down, the salty smell of lei flowers heavy in the air. Liliʻuokalani, clad in black for mourning but crowned in duty, steps forward with steady grace. Quirky tidbit: at her accession, some foreign journalists fussed over the fact that she wore a Western-style gown while still draped in Hawaiian symbols of sovereignty. They couldn't quite comprehend that a monarch could embody both worlds at once. Imagine their confusion scribbling notes in the heat, while Liliʻuokalani probably thought, "Yes, gentlemen, I can wear silk and feathers." Try to keep up. Historians still argue whether her reign was doomed from the start, or whether she might have preserved Hawaii's sovereignty with more time. Some say the forces of annexation were unstoppable by the 1890s. Others insist a more pliant monarch might have bought the kingdom decades longer. You, standing at her side, sense the impossible balance she is asked to maintain. dignity, tradition, diplomacy, all while her power is already clipped. The day of her accession is solemn but resolute. Picture her walking through the palace halls, the air heavy with mourning banners. She pauses at her brother's portrait, gazes quietly and whispers a promise. You follow her into the throne room, where officials kneel and offer oaths. Their voices echo against marble, yet in the back row you notice foreign businessmen whispering to each other, already calculating. That evening she sits at her piano once more. Outside, Honolulu glows with torchlight as her people celebrate. Inside, her fingers move across the keys in a song of grief and determination. You linger by the window, listening, your eyes heavy with both sadness and the slow rhythm of her music. Another quirky image. During her first weeks as queen, she insisted on continuing her brother's tradition of entertaining with lavish luau's, but with her own restrained style. One guest noted she swapped extravagant imported wines for more modest fare, quietly signaling that dignity did not require excess. It was her way of honoring culture, while balancing the kingdom's strained finances. Liliʻuokalani's accession was not the triumphant fairy tale coronation of a queen ascending with unchallenged authority. It was the steadying of a fragile throne. She had already tasted governance during her regency. Now every decision was hers, yet she knew her crown sat on quicksand. The bayonet constitution had clipped the monarchy's wings, and foreign interests watched like vultures. Still, in that first year, she carried herself with confidence. She attended ceremonies, welcomed diplomats, and reassured her people. She was not her brother. She was quieter, more measured, but she radiated determination. Hawaiians admired her for her dignity, her calm strength, and her refusal to be cowed. You stand with her on the balcony of Iolani Palace as night deepens. The stars glitter overhead, the streets below still alive with chants and cheers. She rests her hands on the railing, the lei around her shoulders fragrant and fading. You sense her resolve hardening. She will fight for her people, even if the world conspires against her. And you, rocking slightly with the hum of drums from the street, feel the drowsiness of history. A new queen has risen, the air thick with mourning and promise. The throne is hers, the burden is hers, and you, lucky or unlucky, get to drift alongside her into the battles to come. You follow Liliʻuokalani into the first serious struggle of her reign, her attempt to restore power to the monarchy through a new constitution. It is 1893, and she has already spent 2 years on the throne, watching how the bayonet constitution of 1887 had crippled her brother's authority, and by extension, hers. She has seen foreign planters dictate terms, watched her people excluded from voting, and felt her crown reduced to decoration. Now she decides it is time to act. The mainstream fact: Liliʻuokalani drafted a new constitution in 1893 that would have restored power to the monarchy and reinstated voting rights for native Hawaiians who had been disenfranchised by property requirements. It was a bold step, one she believed necessary to preserve Hawaiian sovereignty. Picture her seated at a desk in Iolani Palace, pen in hand, the air thick with candle smoke. Papers lie spread before her, drafts covered in revisions. You hover nearby, watching ink soak into parchment as she writes provisions to strengthen the crown and expand suffrage. Each scratch of her pen is deliberate, as if she knows history is balanced on the point of her nib. Quirky tidbit: she reportedly practiced piano nearby between writing sessions, stepping away from the desk to let her mind clear in melody before returning to her drafts. Imagine her composing a regal hymn one moment and jotting down constitutional clauses, the next multitasking between music and politics like only she could. Historians, still argue whether her constitution was politically wise. Some say it was the only way to rescue Hawaiian independence. Others claim it was too risky, provoking the very forces that soon overthrew her. Was it courage or miscalculation? The debate still hums like a distant drumbeat. She knew the risks, though. Members of her cabinet hesitated, worried about foreign reaction. Planters muttered angrily, their suspicion growing sharper. But Liliʻuokalani felt her people behind her. Petitions poured in, voices begging for the monarchy to stand strong. At gatherings, Hawaiians sang to her, cheered her, laid lays at her feet. She felt their faith and knew she could not simply endure quietly. Imagine the scene in January 1893. She prepares to present the Constitution. Ministers stand stiff, some supportive, others fearful. Outside the palace, Hawaiians wait, hearts pounding, ready to celebrate a return of dignity. You can feel the electricity in the air, the hum of hope. Liliʻuokalani's voice is steady as she announces her intent, though her words catch on the heavy silence of officials unwilling to endorse her openly. Another quirky image. Some palace staff whispered that her drafts were written so neatly and carefully, they looked almost like sheet music. Straight lines, flowing curves, elegant as though designed to be sung rather than debated. And perhaps in her mind, they were a kind of song, a hymn to her people's sovereignty. The pushback is immediate. Foreign newspapers accuse her of tyranny. Businessmen mutter about lost profits. Ministers balk, their faces pale. The Constitution is never formally enacted. It hovers in limbo, a ghost of what might have been. But its existence is enough to trigger the fury of those already plotting to depose her. At night, after the tense meetings, she sits at her piano again. Her fingers pressed down harder than usual, the melody sharp, almost angry. You sit nearby, drowsy, letting the music rumble through your bones. It is not lullaby now. It is defiance disguised as song. Liliʻuokalani's constitution never became law, but it became legend. It was her declaration that the monarchy was not dead, that Hawaiian voices still mattered. And though her enemies seized on it as justification for the coup that soon followed, her people remembered it as proof that their queen had tried. You step onto the palace balcony with her, looking out at Honolulu in the twilight. The city seems calm, lanterns glowing, waves lapping. But beneath that calm, currents swirl. The Queen clutches her draft constitution, her eyes fixed on the horizon. You know what she does not yet know, that the storm is nearly here. And you, weary traveler of history, feel the heaviness in the air press down like a hand on your shoulder. You arrive at the moment when the storm finally breaks. The year is 1893, and Liliʻuokalani's cautious steps toward restoring a stronger monarchy ignite the fury of her opponents. You stand in the palace grounds, the air sticky and tense, as the overthrow begins to unfold around you. The mainstream fact. In January 1893, a group of mostly American and European businessmen, supported by the U.S. Minister to Hawaii and backed by a detachment of U.S. Marines, staged a coup that toppled Queen Liliʻuokalani's government. They declared a provisional government, citing her proposed constitution as justification. Picture it, boots pounding on Honolulu's dusty streets, rifles glinting in the sun, nervous crowds gathering. Outside Iolani Palace, voices clash, Hawaiians chanting support for their queen, planters and militia shouting orders. You slip through the throng like a ghost, feeling the heat, the fear, the way history can suddenly move faster than breath. Quirky tidbit. Some eyewitnesses later recalled that the Marines sent ashore lounged casually at first, even playing cards in the shade while waiting for orders. It's a surreal image, men in uniform shuffling decks of cards, while the monarchy of Hawaii trembled just a block away. You can almost hear Liliʻuokalani muttering, "So this is how sovereignty ends." With poker in the sunshine? Historians still argue whether the United States planned the overthrow in advance, or whether opportunistic businessmen exploited a moment of tension. Some claim Washington had already decided annexation was the goal. Others insist local elites acted first and the US merely enabled them. Either way, the result was the same. The Queen's throne was pulled out from beneath her. Inside the palace, Liliʻuokalani faced impossible choices. She could call her loyalists to arms, risk bloodshed in the streets, and perhaps plunge Honolulu into chaos. Or she could yield, hoping diplomacy might yet preserve her people's lives and her kingdom's chance at restoration. You watch her standing in the throne room, ministers whispering anxiously, the sounds of marching outside seeping through the windows. She chooses restraint. In a statement that would echo through history, she temporarily yields her authority to avoid violence, trusting that the United States government, once informed, would restore her. Imagine the silence in that room as she sets aside the crown, her voice steady though her heart breaks. You're there invisible, holding your breath as the last Hawaiian monarch steps down without a fight. Another strange image. Some residents describe the provisional government's proclamation as being read from the steps of a government building, to a crowd so small it could barely hear. Yet those few words, carried by paper and rumor, changed the fate of the islands forever. You can almost picture a sleepy passerby squinting at the announcement and muttering, "Wait, we did what?" The Queen withdraws into the palace, her dignity intact but her authority stripped. Hawaiians gather outside, confused and angry, yet reluctant to rise against US firepower. The streets buzz with tension, the scent of gunpowder faint in the air. You drift through the city, hearing both cheers from foreign settlers and tears from native Hawaiians. It is a day of division, one that will never be forgotten. That night the palace is eerily quiet. Liliʻuokalani sits in a dimly lit room, the draft of her new constitution still on the table before her. She does not burn it, does not crumple it. She lets it lie, a reminder of both her courage and her downfall. She touches the piano keys softly, playing a mournful tune that seems to rise through the palace walls and out into the troubled city. You sit with her in silence, your own head heavy with fatigue. Outside, soldiers shuffle, boots clicking on stone, while inside the Queen's music lulls you like a funeral chant. The overthrow is complete. The monarchy is broken. And yet, as you drift, you realize the Queen has not lost her voice. That voice will echo long after rifles have been stacked away. You linger in the uneasy days that follow the overthrow, when Queen Liliʻuokalani no longer holds authority, but still commands loyalty. The provisional government has declared itself in charge, a small group of businessmen in suits suddenly calling themselves rulers. You walk behind them into government offices, heavy wooden desks, hastily drafted proclamations, the faint smell of cigar smoke. They seem more anxious than triumphant, but with rifles and foreign backing, their control hardens. The mainstream fact, the provisional government, led by Sanford B. Dole and other prominent planters, was established immediately after the coup in January 1893. Though it lacked widespread Hawaiian support, it had recognition from US representatives on the islands and the military presence of US Marines. Imagine Honolulu during these weeks. Posters appear announcing the new order. Foreign residents nod approvingly. Native Hawaiians mutter in grief. In the streets, soldiers march stiffly, their boots leaving tracks in the dust. At Iolani Palace, the royal flag is lowered, replaced by the provisional government's banner. You stand beside Liliʻuokalani as she watches from a window, her jaw tight, her hands still. Quirky tidbit, the palace itself was treated with a kind of awkward reverence by the new rulers. They used its grand halls for meetings, but some ministers were so unfamiliar with the space that they reportedly got lost in its corridors. You can almost hear Liliʻuokalani's dry inner voice. Strange to steal a kingdom and not know the way to the throne room. Historians still argue whether the provisional government ever had legitimacy. Some call it a puppet regime of foreign planters. Others suggest it was a genuine, if fragile, attempt to stabilize the islands. The truth lies somewhere in the middle, but one fact is clear. It did not speak for the majority of Hawaiians. Liliʻuokalani herself remained at Washington Place, her home, rather than the palace now claimed by others. She issued formal protests, writing to the US president and appealing to international law. You imagine her seated at a desk, carefully choosing her words, her handwriting neat even as her heart burned. She insisted that she had yielded temporarily, trusting in the justice of the American government to restore her. Walk with her through Honolulu now. Ordinary Hawaiians still bow respectfully, still call her our queen. Some bring leis, some kneel at her feet. Yet soldiers watch closely, ready to quell any uprising. The atmosphere is tense, fragile, like a taut string that could snap at any moment. You move quietly in her shadow, listening to whispers in Hawaiian. She is still our ali'i, no matter what they say. Another odd image. Members of the provisional government were so paranoid about being attacked that they sometimes patrolled at night with lanterns and rifles, startling stray dogs and waking neighbors. It's almost comical. You can picture a group of powerful men jumping at shadows while the queen, unarmed, slept peacefully in her home. But peace was deceptive. Within months, the provisional government was lobbying openly for annexation to the United States, a move Hawaiians opposed through petitions and protests. Liliʻuokalani, still carrying herself with royal dignity, urged her people to remain calm. Violence, she believed, would only give her enemies justification. Instead, she placed her faith in diplomacy. You stand with her as she receives visitors, supporters kneeling, crying, pleading for her return to the throne. She reassures them gently, her voice calm. Inside, you sense her heartbreak, but she never lets it show. Her resolve is as steady as the ocean tide. At night, she writes again, her lamplight glowing in Washington Place. Outside, guards pace. Inside, her pen scratches across paper, appeals to Washington, arguments grounded in law and justice. You weary listener, hear the rhythm of that pen and feel your own breath slowing. The world may be swirling with politics, but her steady hand lulls you toward calm. The monarchy is gone in name, but not in spirit. Hawaiians still look to her. The provisional government claims victory, but it feels shaky, nervous, brittle. And you, drifting behind the queen, sense that her story is far from over. You drift forward into 1895, when the queen's quiet dignity is shattered by her imprisonment. Iolani Palace, once the glittering symbol of monarchy, becomes her cage. You step through its ornate doors with her, not as a guest this time, but as a prisoner. The polished floors echoing under boots that do not belong to her guards, but to her captors. The mainstream fact, after a failed royalist uprising in January 1895, in which loyalists attempted to restore the monarchy, Queen Liliʻuokalani was arrested by the provisional government and confined to a suite of rooms on the upper floor of Iolani Palace. She remained imprisoned there for nearly 8 months. Picture her first night of confinement. The heavy door closes, the key turns, and silence settles. The room is furnished, yes, this is not a dungeon, but the velvet curtains feel like bars, and the gilded mirrors reflect only loneliness. You stand in the corner, watching her lower herself into a chair, her black dress blending into the shadows. Outside, soldiers pace. Inside, her breath steadies. She will endure quirky tidbit. While imprisoned, she was guarded not by faceless strangers, but by men she had once known, ordinary Hawaiians who had now been conscripted to serve the provisional government. Imagine the awkwardness of a guard bowing stiffly to his queen, while also ordered to ensure she did not leave. It was loyalty tangled into duty, heartbreak pressed into uniform. Historians still argue whether her imprisonment was necessary or a cruel act of intimidation. Some say it prevented further uprisings. Others insist it was meant simply to break her spirit. The debates echo even now, though you, drifting in her shadow, feel the cruelty plain. A queen locked away in her own palace. Her days took on a rhythm. She rose early, sometimes pacing the carpeted floor, sometimes sitting at her writing desk. She prayed, she composed, she read. Visitors were few and carefully monitored. She watched the city from her window, longing to walk freely through her gardens. You stand beside her at the glass, seeing Honolulu spread below, the ocean glittering beyond. Freedom close but unreachable. At times, she could hear voices outside, the chants of supporters gathered beyond the palace gates. They brought leis, they sang, they called out to her. Guards dispersed them, but the echoes reached her ears. Each shout was both comfort and pain. Her people had not forgotten, but she could not answer. Another detail. She slept in a grand bed that had once been a symbol of luxury, but under confinement, it became a reminder of loss. The very palace that once rang with her music now hummed only with the shuffle of guards and the creak of doors. You, trying to keep your eyes open, feel the oppressive quiet seep into you too, the silence so thick it makes you drowsy. Yet she did not despair. Instead, she turned again to creativity. During her confinement, she composed songs and hymns that carried her grief but also her faith. Her music became her resistance, her way of keeping her spirit free even as her body was confined. You sit near as she hums softly in the evening, the melody rising like a prayer against the heavy walls. One odd story whispers through these halls. A guard claimed the queen sometimes walked the rooms at night with a candle, her shadow flickering huge against the walls, making her look like a giant striding through her own prison. Imagine the sight, both eerie and defiant. Even in captivity, she could not be made small. Her imprisonment lasted months, until she finally signed a document formally abdicating her throne in exchange for the release of royalist prisoners. It was another act of sacrifice, choosing her people's lives over her crown. You watch her pen move across the page, her hand steady, her eyes firm. She yields again, not because she is weak, but because she is strong enough to endure humiliation for the sake of others. At night, she lies awake, listening to the faint sound of soldiers below, the ocean beyond, her heart beating in rhythm with the waves. You lie with her in imagination, the heavy air pressing down, the silence broken only by the soft hum of her newest song. The queen is captive, but her spirit wanders free. You remain with the queen in those long, hushed months of confinement, but instead of silence, you notice her hands are busy. Liliʻuokalani takes up needle and thread, and with each stitch she transforms sorrow into memory. The quilt she creates within the palace walls is not just fabric. It is testimony, protest, and comfort. You sit nearby, watching the needle flash in lamplight as the hours of captivity pass. The mainstream fact: during her imprisonment at Iolani Palace in 1895, Liliʻuokalani began making what became known as the Queen's Quilt. Stitched together with scraps of cloth, it recorded names, dates, and symbols of her life and her people, a patchwork journal of resistance. Picture her bent over the fabric, pulling colorful pieces together from discarded dresses, household linens, and gifts from loyal friends. Each square tells a story. Flowers, crowns, initials, even cryptic phrases sewn carefully into the seams. You lean in to read them, The letters tiny but insistent, like whispers across time. Quirky tidbit. She didn't always sew alone. Some of her companions and attendants helped, contributing patches and designs. Imagine them huddled together in the dim light, gossiping softly, perhaps even laughing at small jokes while outside guards clomped stiffly on patrol. It's a strangely cozy rebellion, needlepoint resistance against rifles. Historians still argue whether the quilt was meant primarily as personal therapy, political statement, or historical record. Was it her way of mourning, or her way of ensuring no one could erase her story? Probably all of these at once. Each patch was a decision to create, not to collapse, to record, not to be silenced. The quilt grows slowly under her hands. She pricks her finger once, a bead of blood staining the fabric. She wipes it away, keeps sewing. You watch, hypnotized by the rhythm, needle in, needle out, thread looping, fabric folding. It's as soothing as a lullaby, a rhythm that settles your breath into something slower, softer. One patch depicts a crown, golden against a darker background. Another bears the initials of loyalists who fought in vain to restore her. Some pieces are almost playful, bright flowers stitched with surprising joy. You realize she is not just preserving grief. She is stitching life itself, stubbornly, square by square. At times she pauses to hum a song, her voice low and steady. The music and the sewing merge, a harmony of hand and voice. You let yourself lean back against the palace wall, eyes half shut, the cadence of needle and melody washing over you. Another odd note. The quilt included fragments of her own dresses, fabric that had once brushed palace floors at Grand Luau's. Now those same silks and cottons were cut and repurposed into memory squares. Imagine the transformation. Gowns once meant for royalty, now reborn as protest art inside a prison. The guards likely didn't understand. To them it was just sewing, a pastime for a dethroned woman. But to Hawaiians who later saw the quilt, it was proof that their queen had endured, that she had left her story in cloth even when words were censored. You sit closer, running your fingers lightly over imagined stitches, feeling the texture of resistance in fabric. Night stretched on, the palace hallways quiet, but for the shuffle of watchmen. In her chamber, however, the queen's needle whispered steadily a small defiance. Each stitch seemed to murmur, "I am here. I remember. I endure." And you, weary listener, almost fall asleep to that rhythm. The thread passes through the cloth again and again, like waves breaking against a reef, relentless, patient, eternal. The quilt is nearly finished. The queen is nearly free, and you are nearly gone to dreams. You drift with Liliʻuokalani beyond the palace walls, into the years when annexation became the hot word on every politician's lips. The monarchy was gone. The provisional government had rebranded itself as the Republic of Hawaii in 1894, and yet the Queen's voice still carried weight. You hear it in the petitions, the debates, the speeches. Her name whispered in Washington. Her presence invoked in Honolulu. The mainstream fact. Annexation was fiercely debated between 1893 and 1898. President Grover Cleveland initially opposed the overthrow, calling it an act of injustice, but his successor, William McKinley, supported annexation. And in 1898, Hawaii was absorbed into the United States through the Newlands Resolution. Picture Liliʻuokalani at Washington Place. Her residence after release from imprisonment. The once grand halls are quieter now, her authority stripped, but visitors come constantly. Hawaiians kneel, bringing petitions, begging her to represent them. She listens patiently, nodding, promising to fight with what tools remain to her. You sit beside her as she reads long lists of names, each one a heartbeat in ink, quirky tidbit. Some Hawaiians carried these petitions door to door across the islands, gathering nearly 40,000 signatures opposing annexation. The papers, stacked together, were so heavy they had to be tied in bundles. Imagine the Queen chuckling softly as attendants staggered into her home, arms full of rolls of paper as if they'd been harvesting sugarcane. Only this crop was resistance. Historians still argue whether the petitions truly influenced Congress or whether annexation was inevitable given American interests in the Pacific. Some scholars insist the protests delayed annexation by several years. Others claim they were little more than symbolic. Yet the Queen herself treated them as sacred proof that her people had not consented. In 1897, she even traveled to Washington, D.C. to present her case. Imagine her walking through snow-dusted streets, cloaked in black, her presence quiet but commanding. Senators and congressmen stared, some impressed, some dismissive, as she argued that Hawaii's people opposed annexation. You shuffle after her through marble halls, chilled to the bone, listening to her dignified voice rise against the clamor of empire. Another quirky note: while in Washington, she was said to have occasionally played the piano at private gatherings, her music softening the edges of political conversations. Picture hardened politicians pausing mid-debate as the Queen's fingers wove sorrow into melody. Even when stripped of power, she could silence a room with song. Back home, Hawaiians waited anxiously. They prayed, they marched, they signed their names. Some whispered rumors that the U.S. might restore the Queen. Others feared the Stars and Stripes would soon replace the Hawaiian flag forever. You stand in Honolulu's streets at night, hearing both hope and dread in the murmurs. Then in 1898, the news arrives. Annexation has passed. Hawaii is officially part of the United States. Fireworks explode in celebration among the foreign elite, while native Hawaiians weep quietly in homes across the islands. Liliʻuokalani sits in her parlor, the telegram in her hands, her face still but her eyes heavy. She does not rage, she does not shout. Instead, she folds the paper carefully and sets it aside, the weight of centuries pressing into her lap. Yet she never recognized the legality of annexation. Until her death, she insisted it was forced, unjust, and without the consent of her people. You admire her resolve, even as your own eyes blur with weariness. Another odd detail: some Hawaiian families reportedly refused to celebrate the 4th of July for decades after annexation, holding quiet household gatherings instead. Imagine the Queen hearing about this, nodding with sad approval, her people resisting in the simplest ways. So the debates rage on, in Washington, in Honolulu, in history books. Was annexation inevitable? Was it theft? You hovering by her side know how she saw it, not the natural flow of history, but the breaking of a promise. The Queen, dethroned but unbroken, carries herself with dignity still, her voice a steady current against the tide. And as you sit with her in Washington Place, the petitions stacked high around her, the lamplight glowing faintly, you feel yourself swaying with drowsiness. Paper rustles like waves, her pen scratches softly, and history lulls you once again. You follow the Queen into a quieter, more reflective act of resistance, the writing of her memoir. No longer able to wield a crown or constitution, Liliʻuokalani turns instead to paper, pen, and memory. You watch her settle at a desk in Washington Place, the lamplight catching her spectacles, her face lined with both sorrow and determination. She begins to write, the mainstream fact. In 1898, Queen Liliʻuokalani published Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen, the only memoir ever written by a Hawaiian monarch. It was both personal history and political plea, aimed at informing the American public about the injustice of the overthrow and annexation. Picture her bent over the manuscript, Her handwriting is deliberate, steady, as if she knows every word may be weighed against her in the court of public opinion. She recalls her childhood, her hānai upbringing, her music, her reign, and the painful days of the coup. You hover nearby, listening to the scratch of pen on paper, a sound that feels almost like a lullaby when repeated hour after hour. Quirky tidbit. The book was first published in Boston, of all places, the city where she had once eaten too many oysters on her travels. Imagine her wry amusement at sending her kingdom's story back across the sea to the very place where she once longed for poi instead of shellfish. Historians still argue whether the memoir changed American hearts. Some say it softened public opinion, presenting the Queen as dignified and unjustly treated. Others claim it was dismissed as sentimental, overshadowed by the momentum of empire. But the fact remains, it gave Hawaiians a voice in their own story at a time when others were writing narratives of progress and inevitability. You read over her shoulder for a moment. The lines flow like music, her prose elegant and measured. She doesn't rant. She reasons. She doesn't beg. She explains. It is the voice of a queen who still believes in justice, even if justice is delayed. Another detail, the memoir includes passages where she gently scolds Americans, reminding them that their own Declaration of Independence condemned the very act they were now committing. Imagine her faint smile as she penned those lines, half sarcastic, half pleading. Do your own words mean nothing to you? The act of writing was itself resistance. It was how she refused silence, how she insisted that history would not forget the Hawaiian perspective. You watch as she closes the manuscript, ties it with ribbon, and prepares it for publication. Her eyes glisten, but her back is straight. When the book appears in print, it causes a stir. Some readers are shocked, some dismissive, some moved to sympathy. Hawaiians read it with pride, finally seeing their story told by their queen rather than filtered through foreign voices. You imagine households where families read passages aloud by lamplight, nodding, murmuring, "Yes, that is how it was." Another quirky image. Copies of her memoir ended up in parlors across New England, stacked between novels and etiquette manuals. Picture a prim Boston matron sipping tea, glancing at the Queen's words and muttering, "Well, I never." Resistance sometimes sneaks in as bedtime reading. For Liliʻuokalani, the memoir was not just about politics. It was also personal therapy. Each word was a way of stitching together her fractured story, much like the quilt she sewed in captivity. You see her eyes soften as she writes about her music, her childhood, her people's love. In those moments, the weight of loss lifts slightly, and you, sitting quietly in the room with her, feel the rhythm of her pen slowing your own heartbeat. The scratching across paper, the turning of pages, the soft sighs between sentences. It all blends into a steady cadence that makes your eyelids heavy. The Queen writes and you drift. Her throne was gone, but her voice was not. Through her memoir, she ensured that long after soldiers left the palace, long after flags were lowered and raised again, her words would still echo. And tonight, in your half-dream, they do. You follow the Queen now into the twilight of her years, when the battles of politics and protest fade into something gentler, though never fully free of sorrow. She is no longer the monarch with a throne, but a dignified elder living quietly in Honolulu, her days filled with routine and reflection. You walk beside her through garden paths, where hibiscus and plumeria bloom, their fragrance heavy in the warm air. The mainstream fact, after annexation in 1898, Liliʻuokalani lived the remainder of her life mostly at Washington Place in Honolulu. She engaged in charitable work, managed her dwindling estate, and remained a symbolic figure for native Hawaiians. She received a modest pension from the US government, though far less than the dignity of her rank deserved. Imagine her mornings. She steps onto her veranda, leaning on a cane, dressed in flowing black gowns she favored in widowhood and mourning. The city hums faintly in the distance, carts rattling, church bells tolling. She breathes in the scent of flowers, then turns back inside to a house full of photographs, heirlooms, and quiet memories. You shuffle after her, the boards creaking under your tired feet. Quirky tidbit. She kept pet peacocks on her grounds, their bright feathers flashing as they strutted across the lawn. Visitors sometimes complained of their shrill cries, but the Queen seemed amused by them. You can almost hear her chuckle softly as a peacock screams at some startled guest, an echo of the flamboyance her brother once adored. Historians still argue whether her later years were marked more by bitterness or serenity. Some describe her as dignified, reconciled, even forgiving. Others emphasize her sorrow, her sense of injustice never fading. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere between. She carried pain, but she also carried grace. She continued to compose music, though less frequently. Sometimes she sat at the piano in her parlor, fingers stiff but still capable of coaxing melodies. Friends and supporters gathered, listening quietly as her voice, older now but still strong, filled the room. You sit among them, your head nodding with drowsiness as the song drifts like incense through the air. Her charity work gave her days purpose. She supported schools, churches, and civic causes, often donating from her own limited funds. She became a patron of Hawaiian choirs and cultural groups, ensuring that the traditions she and her brother had revived would not wither. Imagine her attending a small gathering at a school, children presenting lays and singing songs she had written. Her eyes glisten, her smile gentle. Another odd note: she loved to ride in a carriage through the streets of Honolulu, even in later years. Passers-by always stopped, removed their hats and bowed as she went by. The US government may have declared her throne abolished, but her people still treated her as ali'i. You ride along in the carriage now, the wheels clattering, the crowd murmuring respectfully. Evenings were quiet. The Queen sat with attendants, perhaps sipping tea, perhaps sewing, perhaps simply gazing into the fading light. She told stories of her childhood, of luaus, of court life, of the overthrow. Her voice was calm, but her listeners often left with tears. You lean against the veranda railing, listening, the sunset bleeding gold and crimson across the sky, until everything feels softened and slow, and sometimes she laughed. She had a sharp wit and enjoyed teasing her attendants with dry humor. Picture her raising an eyebrow when someone fussed too much, or making a sly remark about politicians who once tried to lecture her. Even dethroned, she never lost her edge. In these years, her home became both sanctuary and shrine. Hawaiians visited, bringing gifts, seeking blessings, simply wanting to be near her. For them, she embodied dignity in the face of loss. For you, drifting through her garden in imagination, she is a calming presence, steady and serene. So the Queen aged gracefully, her crown replaced by memory, her palace replaced by a home, her throne replaced by a chair on the veranda. She remained herself, unyielding in dignity, tender in song, sharp in wit. And you, following her slowly through the garden paths, feel your own breath lengthen, your steps grow slower, your mind sliding toward sleep. You stay close as Liliʻuokalani moves through the later years of her life, no longer ruling, but still a presence in the heart of Hawaiian society. She has become less a political leader and more a cultural symbol, and you trail behind her as she attends gatherings where her music, her charity, and her sheer presence fill the room with reverence. The mainstream fact: even after her overthrow, Liliʻuokalani remained widely respected as a composer. She wrote more than 150 songs, many of which became central to Hawaiian choral traditions. Her most famous Aloha O was sung at farewells, funerals, and gatherings, an unofficial anthem of Hawaii that endures to this day. Picture her seated in a church pew at a charity concert. The choir begins, their voices rising in harmony. They are singing one of her compositions, perhaps a hymn in Hawaiian, perhaps a love song repurposed as a lament. The sound swells, filling the rafters, and you glance at the Queen. Her hands are folded, her eyes closed, her lips moving faintly with the words. You sitting nearby feel your eyelids droop with the rhythm of the voices, the slow wash of harmony like waves on sand. Quirky tidbit at some gatherings, she insisted on correcting choirs if they sang her songs too quickly. She preferred them slow, almost like prayers, each note savored. Imagine her raising her hand mid-performance, saying gently, "Slower, slower. It must flow like the tide." The choir would chuckle nervously, then obey, dragging the tempo into something so calm it could almost rock you to sleep. Historians still argue whether her later years as a cultural figure softened the political sting of her overthrow. Did her presence reassure Hawaiians that their identity remained strong, or did it allow foreign rulers to treat her as a benign relic instead of a reminder of resistance? Either way, she was never irrelevant. Her home at Washington Place became a hub of cultural life. Visitors brought flowers. Choirs came to perform, children recited poems. Some came just to kneel before her, touch her hand and feel that they had been blessed by their queen. You imagine the front lawn filled with voices singing Aloha O, the notes drifting upward into the palm trees. Another odd image. She sometimes composed on scraps of paper, even in her later years, scribbling down a melody on the back of a letter or a grocery list. Imagine finding her in her parlor, a stack of bills on one side, and amid them, a few bars of music penciled in. Art doesn't always wait for tidy stationery. Liliʻuokalani gave generously to charities, particularly those supporting orphans and education. She established the Queen Liliʻuokalani Trust, which still exists today to aid Hawaiian children in need. Picture her at the signing of the Trust's papers, her hand steady, her eyes shining as she murmurs, "For the children." You're there, standing in the corner, drowsy but moved by the foresight of a queen thinking beyond her own lifetime. In gatherings large or small, her music anchored the room. You sit through one more evening performance, the choir soft, the harmonies weaving through the air. Outside, a warm night breeze stirs, carrying the scent of ginger blossoms. Inside, the Queen's presence glows like lamplight, steady, enduring. And when the concert ends, she rises slowly, leaning on her cane, smiling at the singers. She thanks them warmly, then steps into the night air. You follow her, the quiet hum of the crowd fading behind you. The Queen's songs linger, hanging in the darkness like constellations. Her throne may have been lost, but her music crowned her still. And you, drifting in her shadow, feel the lull of those melodies seep into your bones, slowing your breath, urging your eyes closed. You step into the final years of Liliʻuokalani's life, when the weight of age pressed gently on her shoulders, but her dignity never faltered. Honolulu in 1917 is a bustling American territory now. Streetcars clattering, soldiers in khaki uniforms, newspapers full of war in Europe, but for Hawaiians, their queen remains a living symbol. You walk with her through these last days, the city's noise softening whenever she appears. The mainstream fact: Queen Liliʻuokalani died on November 11, 1917, at the age of 79. Her passing was marked by immense public mourning, with thousands of Hawaiians lining the streets of Honolulu to pay their respects during her funeral procession. Picture her in her final months at Washington Place. She is frail now, her steps slower, her voice quieter, yet her presence still commands reverence. Attendants help her to her veranda, where she sits wrapped in shawls gazing at the garden. The peacocks strut across the lawn, their calls sharp and proud, a reminder of the vibrancy she carried in younger years. You stand beside her, the sunlight warm, the air fragrant, her silence deep but peaceful, quirky tidbit. In her later years, she loved to feed her peacocks bits of bread, chuckling when they bickered noisily over crumbs. Imagine the Queen of Hawaii, dethroned but smiling, tossing scraps to birds as if she had all the time in the world. History is full of such humble moments that historians overlook, but they say more than treaties ever could. Her health declined steadily, and by autumn of 1917, it is clear the end is near. Doctors come and go. Attendants whisper in hushed tones, and Hawaiians gather outside her residence, leaving flowers at the gates. She spends her last days in quiet prayer, sometimes humming hymns she had composed decades earlier. You hear her faint voice in the dark, a melody trembling but steady, like the last flicker of a candle. Historians still argue whether her death marked the final close of Hawaii's monarchy, or whether she had already ensured its spirit would live on. Some say the crown ended with her, others insist the crown simply transformed, carried in culture and memory. Either way, the grief of her people proved she had never ceased to reign in their hearts. On November 11th, 1917, the news spreads, the Queen is gone. Church bells toll mournfully, their chimes drifting through the city. Honolulu falls into solemnity, businesses closing, crowds gathering in black. You stand in the streets as her coffin, draped in Hawaiian flags and leis, is carried in procession. Thousands of voices rise in song, Hawaiian hymns echoing down King Street, the air thick with flowers and tears. Another odd detail, some accounts mention that mourners covered her coffin so completely with leis that the pallbearers struggled under the weight. Picture it, mountains of blossoms, fragrant and heavy, as if all of Hawaii tried to wrap her in love one last time. The funeral moves slowly, deliberately. Soldiers march, choirs sing, children cry softly. You walk with the crowd, swept up in the tide of grief. The procession winds toward the royal mausoleum at Mauna Ala, where she is laid to rest among her ancestors. The sun lowers, torches flicker, and the island exhales its sorrow. For days afterward, Honolulu feels hushed. People speak her name softly, as though she might still be listening. At Washington Place, her peacocks cry into the night, their voices sharp in the silence. You linger in the garden, the Queen gone, but her presence still palpable, as if her spirit hums faintly in the breeze. And you, weary listener, feel the solemnity wrap around you like a heavy quilt. The Queen has departed, the kingdom long gone, but her dignity endures. You let the funeral chants echo in your ears until they blur into dream. You remain in Honolulu after the Queen's funeral, listening as her name lingers on the lips of her people. She has gone, yet her legacy breathes in music, in stories, in the stubborn rhythm of waves hitting the shore. The monarchy is no longer, the islands are now an American territory. But Liliʻuokalani's spirit has become something larger than a throne. The mainstream fact. Today she is remembered not only as Hawaii's last monarch, but as a cultural icon, composer of Aloha Oe, defender of Hawaiian sovereignty, and patron of education and children's welfare through the Queen Liliʻuokalani Trust. Picture her songs drifting into the present. A choir sings Aloha O at a school recital. A family hums it softly at a farewell gathering at Honolulu Harbor. Tourists hear it played on ukuleles, without knowing the Queen wrote it as a bittersweet song of parting. You sit nearby, recognizing the layers of meaning hidden in the notes, and let the melody rock you like a tide. Quirky tidbit, her face still appears on modern Hawaiian quilts, statues, even street murals, often with her beloved peacocks tucked nearby. Imagine her seeing that today, half amused, half proud, that the birds squawking in her yard now strut across city walls as symbols of royalty. Historians still argue how best to frame her legacy. Was she primarily a tragic figure, undone by forces too large to resist, or was she a victor of memory, ensuring her people's voice would never be erased? The debate continues, but Hawaiians themselves often answer with lei laid gently at her statue. She is simply their queen. You walk through modern Honolulu in imagination. Cars honk, planes roar overhead. Yet when you pause by the statue of Liliʻuokalani outside Iolani Palace, the world quiets. Someone has left fresh flowers. Someone has whispered a prayer. Children laugh nearby, their voices high and bright. The Queen's shadow is not oppressive, it is protective. Another detail. Her trust for orphaned and destitute Hawaiian children still functions today, more than a century after she signed it into existence. Thousands have been helped by her foresight. You imagine her smiling faintly in the beyond, satisfied that even in death, she continues to care for her people. Her legacy flows not just in statues and institutions, but in daily life, in the use of the Hawaiian language, once suppressed but now flourishing, in hula, once condemned but now proudly performed worldwide, in the very resilience of a people who refuse to forget. All of these currents trace back to her, to the Queen who refused to be erased. You stand with her memory on the shoreline at dusk. The waves sigh, the stars begin to pierce the velvet sky, and her songs echo faintly in your ears. Her reign ended, her life ended, but her story has not. It hums in choirs, in quilts, in gardens, in petitions, in every lei laid gently across stone. And now, as the story winds down, so too does your breath. The Queen's journey has carried you through birth, childhood, court, marriage, music, overthrow, prison, and legacy. You are tired, lulled by the slow rhythm of her life, each chapter stitched into the quilt of history. So here you are, at the end of the long path. The torches have burned low, the choirs have gone quiet, and Honolulu's night air is soft once more. You breathe deeply, letting the warmth settle into your bones, and feel the weight of centuries easing into stillness. Close your eyes and picture her garden, Washington Place quiet, peacocks dozing in trees. The scent of plumeria drifts faintly, mingling with the salt of the sea breeze. In the distance, a single ukulele strums aloha-o slow and tender. Each note stretches longer and longer until it feels less like music and more like a sigh. The story of Queen Liliʻuokalani is no longer rushing. It has slowed to the pace of the tide, a rhythm that asks nothing of you but rest. History's debates can wait, politics can fade. What remains is dignity, music, and the reminder that even in loss, beauty survives. Your breath matches the ocean now, steady, patient, infinite. The quilt of her life is finished, every patch sewn, every seam smoothed. You lie beneath it in imagination, warm, safe, cocooned. Her songs linger like a lullaby, her presence like a gentle hand resting on your shoulder. Let the night carry you. Let the Queen's story fade into dream. The waves roll on, the stars keep watch, and sleep comes as softly as a lei laid across your chest.